How's it going, everyone? This is MindBlank and welcome back to my channel. We're back in my Why Are RAM Prices So High video. I said that the PC Tech Press was beating the drum on is it time to upgrade your 2500K for some time now. It just so happens that I kinda am one of those PC Tech media outlets and I wanna beat it too. The drum, I mean, the 2500K drum, of course. It's just that now we finally have a good reason for it. I've owned in the past 6 years 3 i5 2500K CPUs. I got my first one in 2012, so it was 1 year after its January 2011 release date. I never could get these things above 4.5, 4.6 GHz without throwing in unsafe voltages though. Back when this thing launched, it was an absolute 4-core, 4-thread monster. It won the appreciation of every PC press and review outlet and became one of the most purchased and long-lasting CPUs to date. How many of you still have a 2500K in your system just waiting for the proper time to upgrade it? Well, I think the time is now with Ryzen 5. Some may argue that it's been time since the 6600K launched, and then the same story with the 7600K, but I will disagree with this, and here's why. Chances are that when you got yours, you moved on from your 2-core CPU, something like the Core 2 Duo, E6600 or E8400, or your Phenom 2 CPUs. Personally, I moved on from a Phenom 2 X4955 at that time, which was a 4-core CPU though, but was still greeted with massive performance increases across the board. If I'd move away in 2017 from the 2500K, I'd not only like better performance, but I'd finally like to have more cores and threads. Here's where the 1600 or 1600X Ryzen 5 come in to do just that. So not only are you getting a performance uplift and a new platform, you're also getting 2 more cores and 8 more threads. In the productivity department, even the 1500X will annihilate the 2500K. There's just no contest here, but then again, I don't know how many of you are using a 2500K just for productivity reasons, seeing that this would have been outdated a long time ago. This particular 2500K spent the majority of its life at 4.5 GHz and 1.31 volts. If you bought a K unlocked i5, then you got it to overclock the thing. It would then be pretty pointless to use a stock 2500K for this test. There's also a pretty huge probability that you're going to overclock your shiny new 1600 or 1600X Ryzen 5. That's why I used 4 GHz overclocks for both the Ryzen 1500X and 1600X featured in this test. 4 GHz is about as easy to hit on these as the 4.5 GHz is on the 2500K. Let's talk about RAM on both platforms. My 1500X maxes out with 3050 MHz RAM, but since that can only be obtained through BCLK overclocking, and that's not a feature that you'll find on the vast majority of boards, I settled on 2933 MHz CL15. The B350 board I'm using is the Gigabyte AB350 Gaming 3, and I'm also running 2933 MHz on my 1600X as well. 3200 MHz is not stable and makes a lot of games crash on my particular 1600X sample. The 2500K, however, is running 2133 MHz CL11 RAM, which is the highest frequency you can get on a P67 or Z67 platform. How much does this help? Well, story time. This system is from a friend who's using it for Battlefield 1 and Overwatch gaming on a 144Hz 1080p ultra-wide panel. He's running an RX 480 clocked at 1380 MHz and he was running 1600 MHz RAM while we were noticing some really upsetting dips below 60 FPS in Battlefield 1 multiplayer around the 55 FPS mark. Simply switching from 1600 MHz CL10 to 2133 MHz CL11, we managed to stop the drops under 60 FPS during heavy fights, like you see here on this graph, which is tested in multiplayer and operations with me running through the same trenches in both scenarios, and we've got a performance uplift on all fronts. So if you're not running 2133 MHz CL11 RAM already, then your 2500K will perform below what I'm seeing here. Testing has been done with a 2100 MHz core and 8800 MHz effective VRAM clock, GTX 1070 and lower than ultra settings. That being said, my frame time analysis skipped the 1500X since I really don't think this is the Ryzen 5 you should choose for this upgrade. It's faster than the 2500K clearly, but if you spend $230 on the i5, you can spend the same amount on the 1600 or the X variant and get those extra threads. Looking at the frame times for Battlefield 1, we can see that the 2500K is really struggling here. There's significant frame time variance, which makes the blue-lined 2500K completely cover up the red-lined 1600X. But moving on, Mass Effect Andromeda is one of the few titles along Battlefield 1 where the 2500K was performing around the same general level as the Ryzen 5 CPUs as far as averages go. Frame times here are looking better for the 2500K than they did in Battlefield 1, and it's the only title where the 2500K has a higher 0.1% low. I found the dips on Ryzen to come when I quickly turned the camera around, so these might as well be caused by assets streaming to the RAM. When we take a look at Witcher 3, there's just no competition with the new Ryzen 5 CPUs. This is a massive 23% delta in averages for the 1600X. Needless to say, the game felt much smoother on the 1600X and even the 1500X for that matter. Frame times again show significant variance and spikes well above 20 milliseconds. In the higher arc square, the GTX 1070 was showing around 55% GPU usage compared to 90% plus on the 1600X. Things didn't change a bunch in Watch Dogs 2. While we do see smaller differences here, I was getting frequent dips to 45 FPS while driving on the 2500K. What's more, the game was much more jittery on the 4-core 4-thread CPU. And while the frame time analysis doesn't necessarily show this, I think it's because there were a lot of dropped frames. My data shows the number of captured frames being 25% lower on the 2500K than on the 1600X Ryzen 5. I never expected Ashes to perform well on the 2500K, but we are in fact seeing a 38% difference to the 1600X. Granted, this title scales well with cores and the 2500K is lacking here, but there were instances where the GTX 1070 was dropping its clock to 2 GHz due to very low GPU usage. So while frame times don't look that bad, there's simply a huge performance gap between these two CPUs. Similar to Ashes, Crysis 3 scales very well with multiple threads, but here we see the biggest delta of all, 55% between the 2500K and 1600X. It's also the most jittery experience out of the three by a long shot. CryEngine 3 is still being used with the most recent title being Prey, so it's not like these results on a more than 2 years old game are meaningless. And frame times are just as bad with even 20 milliseconds frame time variance. They speak for themselves. I keep saying that Mafia 3 is badly optimized and there's no doubt in my mind, but on the 2500K you're barely pushing above 50 FPS average on the overclocked 1070 with medium settings. Even the 1500X offers a much more enjoyable experience, while the 1600X is still far away from 100% squeezing the GPU of its power like pretty much any CPU in this game, to be fair. And we have a lot of skipped frames here, around 25% more recorded frames for the 1600X raw data. That's why the blue line is relatively okay looking. And lastly, we've got GTA 5. It's the only game here where all CPUs are a far cry away from providing a high GPU utilization, and the only game where, despite the numbers, it didn't feel bad on the 2500K. Like we've been used to so far, there's significant frame time variance here, but it's also present on the 1600X. Alright, so the 1500X is already giving us better performance than the 2500K, and remember, the i5 is running the fastest memory the platform allows. If you're not running 2133 MHz, you are simply getting worse performance already. I find that 2933 MHz CL15 or 16 RAM is not that expensive considering today's jacked up DRAM prices, and there's still a bit more performance to be had out of the Ryzen 5 CPUs. For example, my 1600X does 4.1 GHz, and if you can get one that can also do 3200 MHz RAM, you're looking at around 5% more performance here, further adding to the gap. There's also a point that some would make: get a used 2600K. Yes, that i7 will offer better performance than the 2500K, but you're still below the 1600X and you're still missing out on 2 physical cores and 4 threads. I think it's time to retire the champion, and I get that by now some of you might even be attached to this piece of silicon. There's simply few CPUs throughout history that have given such a bang for your buck in a 6-year time span.
Are you still using a 2500K or are planning to upgrade to a Ryzen 5 1600 or 1600X? Let me know in the comments down below, and while you're at it, leave me your questions and suggestions. Thank you for supporting this channel, and don't forget to check out my Twitter and Patreon page linked in the description down below. See you next time everybody, bye bye.